A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start the day with the prelims theme of the day. Today we'll take up geography and environment. First, you will have to make a list of the clouds, that is, what are the types of clouds and what are the features of each of these types and how do they form. So, we usually get confused between the different types of clouds, so it's important that we have clarity on this. So, this one, and the second is you will have to make a list of some of the concept keywords in ecology. I'll give an example. I will give you examples of few. For instance, ecotone, Sere, or commensalism, xerophytes, sclerophytes, biota. So these are some of the examples of keywords that you come across in ecology. So in this case, what you have to do is each of you will make a list of at least 5 keywords, and before you comment your answer, just go through the comments of the others and make sure that you are not repeating the keywords. So by the end of the day, if each of you comment this way and come out with unique keywords in ecology, we will have a comprehensive list of keywords which you will just need to revise the day before your exam. And these keywords are very important in ecology, and several direct questions come on these keywords itself. So that's it. So we'll take up the topics for the day. So we will start with the first topic of the day. This is related to the center-state relations and is a part of your GS2 syllabus. So this is about the GST compensation which the center is supposed to give to the states under the GST Act. So in fact, when we talk of center-state relations, one very important concept that we'll be talking about is the cooperative federalism. And always when we talk of GST is always hailed as an illustrative example of the cooperative federalism between the center and the states. So in this case, how this cooperative federalism that which could be achieved, because if you consider the case of GST, the states are losing a part of their tax kitty. They are giving up their autonomy to levy taxes over certain subjects, because GST is about one nation, one tax. So the state governments have lost that autonomy to tax some of the subjects which they were earlier able to tax. So therefore, it is a very successful example of cooperative federalism. And how did the center get the cooperation from the states in this regard? The center had promised that for any revenue shortfalls that the states may suffer in the initial years of GST introduction, the center is going to pay this compensation to the states. So whenever the states are suffering any revenue shortfalls because of the newly introduced GST, the center is going to compensate the states for the same. So for this purpose, how is the center going to get the funds for compensation? For this, the center introduced what is called as the compensation cess. So through this cess, whatever money is collected, that money will go to paying the compensation to the states which are suffering the revenue losses. But however, because of the COVID-19 pandemic now, the amount that has gotten collected in this compensation cess has been very less. But however, the dues that the center has to give to the states is over 3 lakh crore. And whatever amount is there in the compensation cess is able to cover just 22% of this 3 lakh crore. So still the center has to compensate to the states nearly 2.35 lakh crores. But center is also faced with a lot of financial constraints. Yesterday we just discussed in the RBI annual report, and it says that it has given 4 important forecasts of the Indian economy, in which one of it says that it's a strained finances of the central government, even the state governments for that matter. So because of the strained finances of the central government due to the COVID situations, it is finding it very difficult to give this compensation of 2.35 lakh crore which the center has promised under the GST setup. So now it has to go back on its promise, otherwise it has to give other options to the states. So now the center has told that the states will have to borrow from the RBI this remaining whatever compensation that the center had to give. Center has its hands tied, it has very scarce financial resources, so it has told the states that the states will have to borrow this amount from the RBI. So this can definitely This is like reneging the promise that the center has given when the GST Act was being passed. So this can also affect the center-state relations, but at the same time, the states are also completely aware of the fiscal condition of the country because of the pandemic. So this can be cited as an example of cooperative federalism when you're talking about GST. And when you're talking about GST in specific, one of the issues you can cite is the delay in the payment of compensation by the center to the states. And because of the critical fiscal situation that the country is facing, the center was unable to compensate that amount to the state as was promised under the GST Act, and it asked the states to borrow from RBI. So this is about the cooperative federalism and the center-state relations, particularly about GST. Now we'll move on to the next topic. Now this is about terrorism, and this is a part of your internal and external security, which is a part of your GS3 syllabus. So first of all, this article says talks about the role of National Investigation Agency. So when you talk of terrorism in your GS paper 3, you may have a question asking you to critically analyze the role that the NIA has played in dealing with the terror attacks in India, and regarding how successful it has been in curbing or investigating successfully the terror incidents in India. So in such a critical analysis, you will have to mention some successful examples of the NIA and also its failures. So first, you will have to understand the origin of NIA being a federal agency which was set up after the 26/11 attacks, specifically targeted at countering the counter-terror activities in India. So in this article, it says how NIA has been able to charge sheet some people who belong to the JEM outfit, including the JEM head Masood Azhar, in the charge sheeted in the Pulwama attacks case. So the Pulwama attack happened where nearly 40 CRPF personnel were killed. So in this case, the NIA has now charge sheeted many of the people, and many of whom who belong to the JEM, which had claimed the responsibility of the attack after the attack had happened, which ended up killing nearly 40 CRPF personnel. So this was based on very thorough and elaborate investigation that included DNA analysis and investigations in the field. So all of this hard work has been done by NIA, and it has now been able to charge sheet nearly 19 people in this particular case. So at least till here you can say that it is a success of NIA. But however, if you have a question like analyze the role of NIA in countering or in tackling the terror incidents in India, then NIA cannot do everything, because it is just an organization which has its own limitations, because every terror attack in a country cannot just be countered by setting up such organizations or institutions. There are factors which go far beyond this and which may actually be the root causes. For instance, in this case, in the Pulwama attack, the truck or the jeep that actually struck the van that was carrying the 40 CRPF personnel, that was driven by a local Kashmiri youth. So he acted as a suicide bomber. So which means that there is some alienation which is felt by the local Kashmiri youth as well. And this could be the root cause of the problem. It is because of this feeling of alienation that these youth are supporting such terrorist activities. So that is how in these terrorist outfits like JEM are able to recruit the youths into these carrying out these terror activities. This is because of this feeling of alienation that is there among the youth in Kashmiris. So this is also is one root cause which needs to be tackled. So if you look at the Kashmir, first of all, the youth population, there is a youth bulge in Kashmir. So that needs to be given a lot of economic opportunities. We need to create more job opportunities for them. We need to ensure more economic development in the region, so that the youth have more avenues and more opportunities that they are looking for, with their aspirations now increasing. That is one thing. The second is, now as you can see that there are a lot of curbs on the internet. So this again is restricting the freedom of expression, which needs to be restored back. There is also the detention of several political leaders in Kashmir without any particular reason they are just being detained for endless number of days. So such detention of political leaders, the political vacuum that is there in the state, all of these are somewhere contributing to that alienation felt among the youth. So this is also the root cause of the problem, and to tackle such terror activities, it is not just needed for these organizations to be on their toes and work hard. It is not just the diplomatic efforts that we are putting in to isolate Pakistan internationally and force Pakistan to act on these terrorist outfits, but we will also have to look at some of the deeper domestic causes like the alienation, and only then the terrorism as such as a menace can be tackled. So this you'll have to point out in your answers when they ask you to analyze the role of NIA, because NIA is not a panacea and it cannot give an end to the terror activities. For that, we will also have to look at the root causes, and then we'll have to rectify that first. So this is related to the terrorism. Now we'll move on to the topic, which is related to digital health ID. So we had previously seen about this digital health ID. So we had seen how there are different stakeholders, and each of these stakeholders can be benefited by digital health ID. We saw how the patients do not need to carry their previous consultations with the doctors, so they don't have to bother about preserving each of those prescriptions and report, and then without forgetting carrying it to the doctors. The doctors don't have to worry about whether the patients have brought with them their complete medical history, all the papers. Similarly, the pharmacists also, the doctors, the patients, the pharmacists, the insurance providers, government, all of these are the different stakeholders we saw in detail. We discussed in detail how each of these are going to be benefited by a digital health ID. So what we are going to discuss in this is the several issues that we may face while implementing the digital health ID, and there are prerequisites which still haven't been put in place for the digital health ID to be very successful. So now we'll have an analysis of all these. First important issue is the data collection. So when we talk of data collection, the data collection in the healthcare system itself is not foolproof. So there are several stages in India's healthcare system where data is not collected properly. So there is the problem per se in the data collection itself. So first we need to rectify this challenge, that only when the data is collected will we be able to digitize the data, and then help, even if we have the digital health ID, if we have some loopholes in the data collection process, then even having a digital ID is not going to help. So this needs to be first of all rectified. The second issue is the privacy. When we talk of privacy, all the information that is collected about the patients, all their medical records, so whether they are going to be confidential is one big question. Particularly, we also do not have the Data Protection Act as of now. So will the privacy of this information be protected, or is it subject to hacking, or will it be shared with various private players? So this is another issue that needs to be ensured, that the confidentiality of the health information about the people are preserved and the privacy is definitely ensured. The third is the absence of a digital ecosystem. Now, what does this mean? Though we are giving a digital health ID to every person, but there is an absence of a digital ecosystem. What this means is, what is the purpose of having a digital ID? It is that if I have a digital ID and if I go to a medical store, if I go to a pharmacy, I must be able to authenticate myself that this is me. Otherwise, what is the point of having an ID? Because somebody else could come, and if, let's say, I am eligible for discounted drugs, so if I do not have to authenticate my digital health ID at a medical store, then somebody else can also come with just my ID and then take those discounted medicines. So therefore this is going to be misused. So that in order to curb this misuse, what should be done is that I need to authenticate myself at the pharmacy with the help of my digital health ID. But when we talk of authentication, we are very well aware how the authentication had failures in the Aadhaar or Aadhaar as well. So even while you have to authenticate your Aadhaar, how many times that authentication fails and the problems that the people have faced, we are already well aware of that. So therefore, this can also create a lot of cumbersome procedures to the people that they are trying to authenticate, but that's not happening. It is giving repeated errors or failures. So we need to check these authentication systems. We need to build that digital ecosystem overall. Now, suppose, for instance, the medicine, so I have been prescribed some medicine, and the pharmacist will have to give me that medicine. So, is the pharmacist going to type the name of the medicine in his computer, or will the medicines be having a barcode and just scanning that the computer is going to recognize it? How is it going to be? And when I'm showing the prescription, is the pharmacist going to manually enter the prescription entire thing in his computer, or will there be e-prescriptions? How is it going to be? So just by giving the digital health ID is not sufficient. We have to think about the conducive digital ecosystem that we also need to put in place for the digital health ID to be successful. So this needs to be first ensured. The next is a public health management information system. So this one is one of the most important things that we need to put in place. Now what is happening is there are so many private sector hospitals and not all of them are regulated. We don't even have an exact count of the number of private hospitals we are having. And also the private hospitals have a they are habituated to underreport the cases. For instance, if malaria is usually reported by these private hospitals, it is said that the actual incidence is at least 20 times higher than what is reported by the private hospitals. The private hospitals often they underreport the number of cases. So therefore, whatever management information system is even getting built is completely distorted because these private health hospitals are not even reporting the exact number of the cases that come to them. So we need to ensure that these private practitioners, the smaller hospitals, even the large private hospitals are at least reporting the data properly. Only when the proper reporting happens can we build a public health management information system that can integrate the correct data from whoever is reporting. So under-reporting is going to make this whole database itself not so useful and productive. So this is one thing that needs to be ensured. Next is a preventive services. So while we talk about a digital health ID, we are kind of ignoring the preventive services. So healthcare should be both preventive and most importantly preventive and then curative. But a digital health ID and the way discussions are going on around it, it seems to give us an impression that the focus is mainly on the curative healthcare but not on the preventive healthcare. For example, if I go to a doctor, the doctor should, according to whatever scheme has been now presented, the doctor should be able to get all the details about me, whether who was the doctor that I consulted before, the kind of diseases that I have. Everything is going to be seen by this doctor with the help of my digital health ID. But to prescribe any medicine or to ascertain what is the kind of illness that I'm going through, the doctor should also know my nutritional profile. What kind of nutrition am I taking? Am I undernourished? So is this also going to be part of the digital health ID? We are not very sure. So these preventive services which talks about what is my nutritional status, what is my body mass index, so all of this are also going to be a part of it. This is not clearly given. So the doctor before prescribing medicines to me should not just know what my previous doctor has spoken about my health, but the doctor should also know what is my nutritional profile so that he knows where exactly do I stand and how vulnerable am I to various diseases and infections. So this preventive thing based on nutrition etc. is not focused upon in the digital health ID. And this is one more issue. The next issue is about the information that is getting collected about a person being very sensitive. And because the information is very sensitive, if it gets hacked or if it gets leaked or if it is shared with third-party private service providers, then there is a good chance of the person being discriminated against based on his health information. For example, if a person has HIV, which is supposed to be a confidential information, and if that data becomes available to the colleagues or the people who are in your immediate environment in an office, let's say, or in a working environment, then there are good chances that that person who has HIV could be stigmatized. Similarly, insurers may deny on some or the other pretext insurance policy to a person who has more complicated health conditions just by looking at the digital health ID and the information about the health about a person. These insurance providers may either reject the insurance itself, or they may set a very high premium for that person. So such kind of discrimination is likely to happen if this sensitive information goes into the hand of people. So just like that, the employers may reject the application of some person. Supposing if a person is diabetic, then an employer may not want to employ her. So on whether it is employment criteria, or if it is insurance, on various in these opportunities, the person may be discriminated against based upon this sensitive or confidential health information if it gets into the hands of the private players. So this is one thing that we need to consider before putting this digital health ID across. Next is the regulation. Regulation is very important. Reason being, even today we do not have an exact count on how many beds are there in the country. We don't have a comprehensive list of the number of private practitioners in India. So, or if we do not have a database of how many beds are there, if we do not have a database of how many private practitioners are there, then obviously data from all these small players cannot be collected. When data from these small players cannot be collected, then we still cannot get the complete health information about the health of a particular person. So if you want this digital health ID to work, it's very important to ensure that these smaller private practitioners, they are also regulated, they register themselves, and we have an exact count of how many private practitioners are there. So regulating this sector is first of all very important to get an exact picture of the number. Only then this database will have any meaning. Next is a public health expenditure. It is said that with a public health expenditure of just around 1.2% of the GDP, we are trying to come out with a digital database when even the most basic of the things are not right. We have a scarcity of medical health professionals in the country. We have a scarcity of doctors and nurses. We have a scarcity of beds. We have the primary health centers which are very inadequately equipped. So when these basic things are lacking, we are trying to come out with this sophisticated digital ID which will do little to improve these grassroots level the primary health and the community health centers, which will actually be the first responders to any kind of illness in the society. So it is that which needs to be strengthened first. If we have to build a universal, robust public health care, then that is what we need to strengthen first before we look into these sophisticated things like the digital health ID. So these are the issues which were discussed in this article regarding the digital health ID and the issues associated with it. Now we'll move on to the next topic, which is related to the India-China relations, and this is a part of your GS2 syllabus on international relations. So in India-China relations, we know that there has been this Galwan clash, and based on that, we have been compelled to think about our economic dependence on China. And day before yesterday, we were discussing how our External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, has spoken about de-risking the supply chains from China, because we need to shift our global economic order where we have excessive dependence on China in the economic terms. We also run a very huge trade deficit with China. So in all this backdrop, in all this context, we have to examine how we are going to de-link from China in the economic terms. And what this entire editorial is explaining is China, by taking several steps and by decoupling from China. So that day also we saw that we were adopting a passive policy of just commercially we were trying to restrict the inputs, but then we have to move to an active economic decoupling policy with China. So this also we discussed the other day. So what this article is trying to tell is for China, India is a very huge market. And if we make China realize that India is a very huge market and it is going to lose such a market if it is having border clashes with India, and if China realizes that India is a very good market for the Chinese products and it does not want to lose the Indian market, and for that, if it understands the advantages of having good relations with India, because that is going to open up a huge Indian market for Chinese products, then China will realize that it has to do something about the border issue, and a push will come from China itself for final settlement of the border once it realizes the economic potential of India and the huge market that India is for the Chinese goods. So in this context, how we are going to decouple from China and how we are going to make China realize that India is not really dependent on its products, and how we can make China realize how important the Indian market is. So for that, the first thing is we need to see the imports from China, and we can see how we can impose more barriers for the imports from China. The first suggestion that has been given in this particular article is that the real exchange rate, if that is appreciating, then it means that our imports are becoming cheaper. So if RBI can stop this real exchange rate appreciation, then it means that the imports are getting more expensive. That will be equivalent to imposing a kind of import duty on the imports from China. So if the real exchange rates are increasing, then it means that the imports are becoming cheaper. If RBI can undo this appreciation in the real exchange rate, then the imports become more expensive, and therefore there will be less import into India. So this gives an indirect effect, or that we are imposing some kind of an import duty on the Chinese imports. We also have to selectively select some of the sectors where we can impose the non-tariff barriers on Chinese imports. So the beginning can be made with the electrical appliances. So by erecting some non-tariff barriers, we are not just reducing the imports from China, but electrical appliances can be one very good area where, by erecting such non-tariff barriers and reducing the imports from China, we can also simultaneously encourage the domestic production and increase the domestic industries' share in the overall market for domestic electrical appliances. So the domestic production can be increased along with this. So this is what we can, through policies, do to the imports from China. The second is, what should be the role of the government in order to decouple from China and be able to strengthen domestic manufacturing sector. First is, the government has to provide facilities for the flow of finance, because finance or credit is very important for the expansion of domestic manufacturing units if they have to produce more and if we have to decouple economically with China. So this cheap credit and affordable credit requires the support of the government. This is first thing we can do. Second is, the government also needs to give an active support on improving the quality of manufacturing. Government has this objective of zero defect, zero effect manufacturing. So our products should be qualitatively so strong that they not just we are able to complete the domestic requirements, but also our products are very competitive at the global level. That can happen only when we produce qualitative products. So government has to support in improving the quality, and also we have to lower the cost of production. Only then we can have a globally competitive prices for our manufactured units, and only then can our share in the global market in the manufacturing can improve. So government support is required for getting affordable and cheap finances, for improving the quality, and for lowering the cost of production. The third thing is, we are also importing a lot of critical inputs from China. One of the most pertinent examples for the critical inputs is the import of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Even though India is a pharmacy of the world, when we talk of the generic drug production from India, so for making these generic drugs, we need what is called as active pharmaceutical ingredients as the raw materials for the manufacture of drugs. But nearly 70% of the import of active pharmaceutical ingredients happens from China itself. So this has become a critical import, and we need to somehow decouple and limit our excessive dependence on China regarding the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So how are we going to do this? So for that, we need to start production of these APIs in India. We have to revive the PSUs that were engaged in the manufacture of APIs. We need to promote the private sector also. Government has already announced a cluster-based approach for these private sectors who are aiming for producing the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and various other incentives need to be given to bring down the cost of manufacturing this. Government must also provide support through environmental clearance, so that there is faster production of the APIs in India itself. So through that we can decouple from China regarding this critical input. The next thing is the foreign direct investment from China. So even in this case, we need to reduce our vulnerability, because there are several strategic sectors into which the Chinese FDI investments are coming, be it the telecom sector or the power grid. So in these cases, we need to reduce our dependence on the Chinese FDI. So in this case, one example is that of the United Kingdom. So UK has now announced that the new Chinese companies which are trying to participate in the expansion of 5G network, so for that Chinese companies are not going to be allowed in UK. So that is those Chinese companies which are trying to participate in the expansion of 5G network in UK, Chinese participation will not be allowed. And even by 2027, all the existing Chinese equipments which are used in UK are also going to be phased out by 2027. This has been announced by the United Kingdom. A similar approach can be followed by India, where it phases out the existing equipments, and also whenever there is new FDI into these strategic sectors like telecom or the power grid, then there is what is called as a national security scrutiny. A national security scrutiny which is done of the Chinese FDI that is coming into these strategic sectors like power grid and telecom. And also we can follow the policy of UK to phase out these equipments which are used in these strategic sectors. So because in telecom and power grid, whatever equipments are used, they are such that they are also vulnerable to hacking. So we need to tackle this by first of all subjecting the Chinese FDI into these strategic sectors through a national security scrutiny, and also we may adopt the UK strategy of phasing out. The next is also with respect to some critical products like, for instance, the solar panels. We import a lot of cheap solar panels from China. In fact, we have also once accused China of dumping the solar panels into India. So for that, we again need to manufacture the solar panels at very cheap cost in India. So this can happen with the support of the government. The government has to come out strongly in support of the private sector manufacturers to bring down the cost of manufacturing of solar panels in India. So government must be able to provide that land, infrastructure, and even cheap electricity for manufacturing the solar panels domestically at very cheap cost, that is to bring down the cost of production. So all these support needs to be given by the government. So by taking up all these measures, we will be able to reduce the imports from China, that is actively decouple from China in economic terms, and that can make China realize how important and how huge a market India has been, and that may push China to come forward and finally settle the border issue so that the Indian market is open to the Chinese goods. So now we move on to the next one, which is related to the health issue. It's a part of your GS2 syllabus, and in that particularly it's about the communicable diseases. So we had seen in one of our previous ICANN videos how the Gurugram Municipal Corporation was using the Gambusia fish for killing the mosquitoes. So this was a strategy that the municipal corporation has adopted to fight the outbreak of dengue. So one more strategy that is often used is the Wolbachia bacteria, which is inserted into the mosquitoes. So there was a study that was done in Indonesia, and what the researchers have found from this study is when these mosquitoes are injected with a bacteria that's called as Wolbachia bacteria, when this bacteria is inserted into the mosquitoes, then these mosquitoes will not be able to carry the dengue virus. So they will struggle to replicate, and because of the presence of this bacteria within them. So when the researchers inserted some of the mosquitoes with this bacteria and they released them into the environment, these mosquitoes breed with the other normal mosquitoes which can actually spread the disease. So when they breed, eventually it so happens that most of the mosquitoes in the locality will be carrying this Wolbachia bacteria. So when they carry the Wolbachia bacteria, they will not be able to pass on the virus, the dengue virus, into the people when they bite. So this was a strategy adopted, that they just took some mosquitoes and infected them with the bacteria, and they let those mosquitoes into the environment. These mosquitoes in turn bred with the other mosquitoes in the environment, and finally there came a generation when almost all the mosquitoes carried the Wolbachia bacteria strain, and because of that they were unable to transmit the virus when they were biting people. So thereby the transmission of dengue reduced. So in fact, the researchers found that the incidence of dengue was nearly 77% lower than in areas where this experiment was not carried out. So this again is one strategy to tackle such communicable diseases like dengue, where the role of science and technology, in this particularly it's a role of biotechnology, that you are putting a bacteria into the mosquito and how the mosquito is unable to spread the virus. So this is the role of biotechnology in tackling such communicable diseases spread as well. So this you can write when you're writing about the strategies to tackle dengue. Which you may get as a question, like what strategies, every year after year we have so many dengue deaths that are happening. So such communicable diseases, what measures should be taken to tackle them? So in which case one is also this measure that you're going to mention. Apart from this, in GS paper 3, when you're writing about biotechnology and its applications, one application can also be mentioned about the Wolbachia bacteria being inserted into mosquitoes and they stopping the spread of the dengue virus. So this is related to the health issue, and in that particularly communicable diseases. Now we'll move on to the next issue, which is the reservation issue. It is a part of your GS2 syllabus, which is about the positive affirmation that is being given to the backward classes. So in this case, the issue that is there before the Supreme Court now is whether quota within quota should be permitted or not. Quota within quota means there are SCs and STs who are now already given reservations. This has been provided for in the Constitution itself, and now what the question that is being faced by the court is whether, if we say SC, whether there can be subcategories of SCs. So for example, if there are in the scheduled caste there are some 5 castes, and in that these 2 castes are more vulnerable, they are more backward, educationally, socially they are more backward, but these 3 castes of the SCs, they have received more benefits of the reservation benefits they have received, and they have progressed a little, but these people have not, it was not possible for them to receive the benefits of reservation, or that they have been socially and educationally backward. In such case, whatever reservation is allocated to SCs, is it possible to have quota within quota? That is it possible to reserve certain percentage of the reservation for SCs to this particular group? So that is a question that is posed before the court now. So now this issue has been referred by the Supreme Court to a larger seven judge bench. This issue has been now referred to as 7 judges bench. Reason being that in the year 2005, Supreme Court has itself decided this issue, and that time it was a 5 judge bench. So now if the same issue needs to be reconsidered again, then it has to go for a larger bench. So now the issue is being referred to as 7 judge bench. So Supreme Court in 2005 had told that it should not be that the state governments are creating subcategories under SCs. So Supreme Court had ruled in 2005 that the state governments should not have the power, or they don't have the power to create subcategories of the SCs for the purpose of reservation. The argument given by the court was that in the Constitution, which provides for such positive affirmation, the whole reason behind this thing was that these scheduled castes have suffered social injustice. They have suffered from the practice of untouchability. So whether among the SCs somebody belongs to a richer, some SCs may be richer and some SCs may be poorer, but both of them would have equally suffered from the social injustice, and both of them would have equally suffered from the practice of untouchability. So whether somebody is richer or poorer among the SCs should not actually matter, because the underlying motive for providing reservation was against this practice of untouchability and social injustice, which every SC would have faced, whether they are, some of them are rich or poor. So that was the basis of ruling of Supreme Court in 2005, that the state governments should not have the power to create subcategories under the SC for targeting them in a better way, for bringing them to equal, bringing them so that they are also equal with the other SCs, which are relatively more forward. Now let's see what has been the stand of various states towards providing subcategories for SCs. So several states, whether it is Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Bihar, they have introduced a special quota for some of the most vulnerable SCs. So the most vulnerable Dalits, they have been given special quota in some of these states. Consider, for example, the case of Tamil Nadu. In this, a 3% quota within the SC quota has been accorded to the Arundhatiyar caste. So this was based on Justice M.S. Janardhan report that came out in Tamil Nadu. And what the Janardhan report observed about this Arundhatiyar caste is that this Arundhatiyar caste forms the 16% of the population of SCs in the state of Tamil Nadu. But however, their representation in the state jobs is only anywhere between 0 to 5%. So they are grossly underrepresented in the government jobs, even though they are SCs and they form 16% of the total SC population in the state. So government reserved 3% quota for them within the SC quota. The same has been the case of Punjab as well. Punjab has also given preference to the Balmikis and the Mazhabi Sikhs within the scheduled castes. So this has been the argument of the states, that some of the SCs are more weaker than the other SCs. They have come out with the concept that there are the weakest of the weak and they need to be given better representation if we need to have an equitable representation, or a representation that is in proportion to their population. So this has been the arguments of the state. Now let's see what the Constitution says. The Constitution in Article 341, it says that it is a president who can include any community as SC or ST in the list. So it is the president who notifies who will all be the SCs and who will all be the STs. This is provided in Article 341 of the Constitution. This is what the Constitution says. Taking from this Article 341, what the Supreme Court has stated in E.V. Chennaya versus the State of Andhra Pradesh case of 2005, which I was just referring to. In this case, Supreme Court says that according to Article 341, it is the President who can include or exclude through notification which communities will belong to the SCs and the STs. So as it is the power of the President to notify, the state governments do not have the power to tinker with this, to modify this. So therefore, the state governments should not have the power to declare any particular SC as a subcategory among the SCs. So this was the stand that the Supreme Court took in E.V. Chennaya case in 2005. So next issue is the creamy layer concept. Those people who prefer to have subcategory under the SCs, they also argue that even for the OBCs there is a creamy layer concept that takes into consideration the incomes of these OBCs. So if OBCs have a creamy layer concept, why can't a similar concept be there for the SCs as well? So even among the SCs, there may be some who must have utilized the reservations for them more, and there may be other SCs to whom the reservation benefits may not have trickled down. So therefore, there are definitely some of the weakest among the weak, and this weakest needs to be provided equitable representation. So for that, this creamy layer concept or subcategories among the SCs can provide a good opportunity for the weakest of the SCs to come at par with the other SCs. So this is the argument of the proponents who say that there must be subcategories under the SC. Next is those who oppose this concept. They say that this may give rise to appeasement to appease the voters. Reason being, if the states are given the power to categorize some of the SCs as the weakest of the weak and provide specific reservation for them within the SC quota, then the state government may choose those subcategories of the SC who may form a considerable vote bank. And in order to appease them, the state government could declare them to be a specific subcategory of SCs which requires quota to be reserved within the SC quota. So this might lead to appeasement politics and therefore it should not be given. So this is the argument of the people who are against the subcategorization within the SC quota. So you may have a question on whether quota within quota should be there or not. If at all there is a question, then you can use these arguments in your for or against arguments. So this is the topic. These were the other topics, other articles that were not really important from the exam point of view. So now we'll see the prelims question that is based on current events. So Carissa Kopili, this was in news. So you have to tell what is this, and you'll also have to tell what was the reason it was in news. So that is it for today. Thank you.